To truly understand England in 1925, we must first look beyond the narrow confines of the island itself. This was the year the sun officially set on British power, even though, ironically, the imperial map suggested otherwise. The British Empire was, in territorial terms, at its magnificent peak. 1/4 of the world's landmass, 1/4 of the world's population, 400 million souls, owed allegiance to King George V. The sheer scale of this colonial project was a daily psychological reassurance to the British public. They were still the greatest global power. Yet this vast size concealed a terrifying truth. The empire was fiscally exhausted. The Great War, fought to preserve the empire's dominance, had cost more than 10 times the annual national income. Britain was deeply in debt, particularly to the burgeoning United States. The flag still flew proudly over Delhi and Ottawa, but the money that kept the Navy sailing was borrowed. The dominions, such as Canada and Australia, having shed their blood on the Western Front, were also beginning to flex their muscles, demanding political autonomy that London could no longer simply deny. In the heart of the capital, London, the mood was a strange juxtaposition of desperate pride and lingering uncertainty. The memory of the 1924-1925 British Empire exhibition at Wembley was still fresh. This enormous spectacle was designed to be a tonic for the nation's morale, a dazzling showcase where visitors could walk through replicated versions of colonial life from Burma to Ceylon. It was a grand exercise in public denial, reminding the British people of their global importance, even as the global balance of power shifted. The City of London, the Square Mile, remained the nervous system of this global trade. Walk down to the docks of East London and your senses would be overwhelmed. The air was a cacophony of smells: damp jute from Calcutta, fresh tea from Darjeeling, raw rubber from Malaya, and the pungent odor of millions of tons of coal smoke. Every ship arriving at the Thames docks was a reminder of Britain's reach. But the wealth it carried rarely stayed in the hands of those who unloaded it. Indeed, the city itself was a microcosm of the imperial dilemma. Just a few miles west of the docks, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and Kensington, fortunes built on these colonial resources were spent on lavish parties and high culture. Yet, in the immediate vicinity of the docks, in the crowded boroughs of the East End, dock workers and their families lived in dark, damp tenements, often without running water. The imperial wealth was flowing into London, but it created chasms of inequality that threatened the nation's social stability. Britain in 1925 was living off the rapidly fading echo of past glory, an empire that was now more of a financial burden and a source of political weakness than an invincible strength. If the empire was fading economically, the nation was bleeding spiritually. 7 years had passed since the armistice ended the Great War, but the silence of the trenches had been replaced by a deep communal grief. In 1925, almost every village in England was still in the process of consecrating or maintaining its war memorial, a stark stone monument bearing the names of the local young men who would never return. This wasn't just history. It was a physical absence in every pub, every sports team, and every family gathering across the country. The demographic wound was perhaps the most profound. A generation of men, often recruited as pals battalions where friends and neighbors signed up together, had been wiped out wholesale. The national cost was almost 1 million lives. This absence led to a severe social imbalance known as the problem of the surplus women. Statistical estimates suggest nearly 2 million women found themselves without any reasonable prospect of marriage, simply because the men of their age group were dead in the mud of Flanders or the Somme. For these women, the choice was clear: embrace a life of independence or face poverty. It inadvertently acted as a catalyst for female liberation. They moved into secretarial work, teaching, and even supervisory roles in the new factories. They cut their hair into short, defiant bobs, the garçon look, and embraced the freedom of the flapper lifestyle, less out of hedonism and more out of necessity. They were the first generation of British women forced to build a life on their own terms, shattering the traditional Victorian expectation that a woman's destiny was tied solely to her husband. Just as visible as the demographic gap were the men who did return, bearing physical and, more often, invisible wounds. Thousands of veterans walked the streets with missing limbs, their faces masked by deep scarring, forever reminders of the brutality of mechanized war. But the most insidious wound was the psychological one: shell shock, the terrifying affliction we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. These men would suddenly freeze at the sound of a loud noise or suffer paralyzing tremors. The British medical establishment, still primitive in its understanding of mental health, often dismissed them as malingerers or cowards. Though the government provided some pensions, a meager sum that often proved insufficient, many heroes of the trenches found themselves pushed to the margins of society, unable to hold down regular jobs. They became a familiar, heartbreaking sight, selling matches or shoelaces on foggy street corners, their war medals pinned to tattered tweed coats. The nation, desperate to move on, often chose to look away from the very men who had saved it. In 1925, England was still fundamentally a nation grieving its youth, trying to dance the Charleston while wearing the shackles of trauma. Economically, 1925 was a pivotal year, and not in a good way. The sense of national solvency that Britain desperately sought was undermined by a grave political decision. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man named Winston Churchill, was convinced that Britain's dignity and global standing rested on the strength of its currency. He believed that the only way to return to true greatness was to restore the City of London's financial reputation. Against the frantic advice of John Maynard Keynes, who famously argued the policy was a return to the pre-war gold cage, Churchill made the controversial decision to return Britain to the gold standard. He wanted to make the pound sterling exchangeable for gold at its pre-war value. It was meant to symbolize economic strength, to look the American dollar in the eye, and to restore the confidence of the City of London. Instead, it was an economic disaster that crippled the nation's core industries, making British goods instantly 20% more expensive abroad. By artificially inflating the pound, British exports, coal, steel, and textiles, became prohibitively costly for other countries to buy. The most immediate and brutal victim was the coal mining industry, the very engine that had powered the British Empire for a century. Foreign markets simply turned to cheaper coal from Germany and Poland. Mine owners, desperate to compete and hemorrhaging money, saw only one solution: their workers. They began implementing radical, often cruel, cost-cutting measures. In the north of England, Wales, and Scotland, miners faced demands to work longer hours, an extra minute on the day, for punishingly less pay. Not a penny on the pay. These men worked in suffocating, dangerous conditions deep underground, often with rudimentary safety equipment and the constant threat of cave-ins and gas explosions. The owners' demands were not just economic, they were an assault on human dignity. The tension was palpable and ran deep, fueled by years of post-war neglect and high unemployment that haunted their communities. The miners' slogan became a defiant roar: "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." This wasn't just a dispute over wages. It was a battle for the soul of the working class. The Trades Union Congress backed the miners, fearing that if the miners fell, every other industrial worker would follow into poverty. Although the catastrophic Great General Strike wouldn't explode until 1926, the entire country, from the halls of Westminster to the smoke-choked streets of the industrial cities, held its breath throughout 1925, knowing the inevitable collision between the workers and the state was just months away. If the coalfields were the site of economic conflict, the great country house was the site of a silent social revolution. The grand, rigid hierarchy of the Downton Abbey lifestyle was dying. Aristocratic families, crippled by the astronomical cost of the Great War and the heavy inheritance taxes, known as death duties, found their fortunes rapidly eroding. With fewer sons to inherit and dwindling cash reserves, the sheer expense of maintaining immense estates became unsupportable. 1925 marked the peak of the breakup of Britain's great landed estates, with hundreds being sold, abandoned, or even demolished. But the most telling sign of the times was the servant problem. Before the war, being a domestic servant was the most common form of employment for women. In 1925, young girls didn't want the life of a scullery maid, working 16 hours a day, sleeping in a cramped attic, and living under the constant tyranny of the housekeeper. They had tasted independence in the war factories and the new, clean office environments. They wanted set hours, a guaranteed wage, and crucially, the freedom of their evenings. Finding staff became a perpetual, agonizing crisis for the gentry. The intricate hierarchy of the downstairs world, the butler, the cook, the hallboy, the footman, collapsed. Families had to consolidate, moving into a smaller wing of their own house and doing their own chores. This was a deep psychological trauma for the upper class, forcing them to confront the reality that they were no longer masters of an endlessly obedient world. Their power was now based on fragile wealth, not divine social right. As the aristocracy declined, a powerful new class rose to prominence, the burgeoning middle class. They were the managers, the accountants, the small business owners, and the professionals. They embraced the new suburban ideal, epitomized by the Metroland phenomenon. New, semi-detached houses built along the expanding London Underground lines. These homes were a huge step up. They usually had electric lights, and most importantly, an indoor flushing toilet, a water closet. This was a symbol of sanitation and privacy that the working classes still envied. Yet, the deep-seated snobbery of the English system refused to die. While the social structure was changing, the attitudes remained rigid. People were judged not just by their wealth, but by their accent, their manners, and the exact location of their house. A successful shopkeeper from the suburbs was still viewed with suspicion by a debt-ridden lord from the countryside. 1925 was a transition point. The physical trappings of class were dissolving, but the psychological barriers, the ingrained sense of knowing one's place, would continue to define British society for decades to come. While the aristocracy was selling their silver and the working class was preparing for war, a different kind of hierarchy thrived in the shadows. This was the era of the organized urban gang, the true British underworld. Though fictionalized accounts often focus on Birmingham, in 1925, the true power rested with the large, heavily armed gangs in the south, primarily the Italian-English Sabini gang, who controlled London's vast network of racecourse betting and protection rackets. These men were the kings of the track, ruthless in their enforcement and a constant thorn in the side of Scotland Yard. The police, or the Met, were struggling to adapt to the speed of modern crime. For decades, policing had relied on bobbies walking the beat, knowing their local patch intimately. Now they faced criminals using fast cars, the same Austin 7s that made the middle class mobile, for quick getaways. Scotland Yard's answer was the formation of the famous Flying Squad, a unit using fast, unmarked vehicles to pursue targets across the capital. But their technology was vastly outmatched by modern criminal ingenuity, and forensics were only just moving out of the Stone Age. While fingerprinting was slowly becoming accepted as scientific evidence, it was far from universal, and the concepts of ballistics analysis or DNA evidence, which wouldn't arrive for decades, were the stuff of futuristic fantasy. Justice, however, was rarely slow. The penalty for murder remained, unequivocally, death by hanging. The nation did not possess the kind of modern legal safety nets we have today. Trials were swift, often relying heavily on eyewitness testimony, which was notoriously unreliable. Public curiosity surrounding sensational criminal cases was enormous. When a murder trial dominated the papers, the streets around the courthouse would be packed with morbidly fascinated spectators. This era saw the public develop a consuming, almost cultural obsession with murder, driven by the desire for sensation in an otherwise mundane, grey existence. This public fascination was fed directly by literature. The golden age of detective fiction was at its peak. Writers like the hugely popular Agatha Christie, who set her meticulous puzzles in the very stately homes we discussed in the last chapter, were providing a sense of comforting order to a chaotic world. Her meticulously constructed murders were always solved, assuring the reader that logic and justice ultimately prevailed, even if the real streets seemed dominated by random violence and corruption. The detective novel became a national pastime, a psychological buffer against the genuine disorder lurking outside the door. For those caught up in the underworld, life was brutal and short. The concept of rehabilitation was barely considered. Prison was purely a matter of punishment and isolation. Gangsters ruled their territories not just with fists, but often with specialized tools, razors sewn into caps being far more fiction than fact. But heavy belt buckles and lead piping were standard issue. Ultimately, the criminal elements of 1925 England were a dark reflection of the economic turmoil. They simply found a way to profit off of desperation and the collapse of traditional morality. They were the ultimate free market opportunists in a time of widespread national struggle and uncertainty. If the nation's political and economic heart was heavy with debt and impending strike action, its cultural pulse in 1925 was pounding with a frantic, hedonistic rhythm. The trauma of the Great War had given birth to a generation determined to live life at full speed, as if every night were borrowed time. The wealthy youth of London, specifically, became famous, or infamous, as the bright young things. Baird, they were the children of the Edwardian era, heirs to vast fortunes, but they had witnessed the catastrophic failure of their parents' values. Their response was outright rebellion against the old guard. They embraced a lifestyle defined by elaborate, often ridiculous, costume parties held in grand Chelsea houses or hidden basement clubs. Scavenger hunts across London became a nightly ritual involving disguises, fast driving, and plenty of alcohol. They were the first generation of British celebrities famous purely for their social excess and their ability to shock the establishment. They were seeking not just pleasure, but profound distraction from the collective grief that still haunted the country. The soundtrack to this rebellion was American jazz. Having crossed the Atlantic, this loud, syncopated, and deeply rhythmic music, the sound of the saxophone and the trumpet, exploded into London's nightlife. Clubs like the Kit Kat Club and the Embassy became vibrant, smoky temples to the new era. It was a crucial cultural exchange, too, as African-American musicians brought a fresh, exciting energy that fundamentally reshaped British popular music. They didn't just play music. They played a feeling of joyous, reckless freedom that perfectly mirrored the mood of the generation. The dance floor became the laboratory of social change. The Charleston, with its energetic, rapid kicking movements, was deemed scandalous by the older, more conservative generation. It was seen as too suggestive, too uncontrolled, a symbol of the moral decay of the post-war world. But for the young, the dance floor was an escape hatch. It was a space where the rigid class and gender lines, which still governed daytime London, could momentarily dissolve into a blur of frantic movement and shared intoxication. And intoxication was central to the scene. These young people drank with a vengeance, consuming potent, new cocktails with names like the Corpse Reviver or the White Lady. Alcohol, however, was not the only vice. Although officially controlled, the use of illicit drugs, particularly cocaine, was surprisingly common in these exclusive circles. It was often known simply by the slang term snow, and it offered a fleeting, crystal-sharp sense of artificial happiness, a necessary anesthetic for a generation haunted by memory. The police, often reluctant to prosecute members of the elite, tended to look the other way, allowing the hedonism to continue relatively unchecked. This pursuit of pleasure was underpinned by a profound sense of nihilism. They were aware that the peace of 1925 felt fragile, that the social and political future was utterly uncertain. The parties, the excessive drinking, the frantic dancing, all of it was an attempt to outrun the long shadow of the war and the hypocrisy that had led the world to the trenches. The bright young things were a cultural symptom, a brilliant, burning flash of defiance before the inevitable economic and political downturn of the late 20s and the Great Depression. Their energy was contagious, eventually filtering down to the growing middle class who sought their own, slightly more respectable forms of after-hours excitement in the newly built suburban dance halls. 1925 was the year the party truly began to peak. If the jazz clubs represented a revolution in morals, the changing landscape of transport represented a revolution in physics and geography. 1925 was the year the speed of British life visibly accelerated, marked by the roar of the internal combustion engine both on the ground and in the air. For the first time since the Romans, the dominance of the slow, patient horse was coming to an end, yielding its place to steel and speed. In the skies, British aviation was entering its golden age, thrilling the public with audacious feats of endurance. Pilots were the new explorers and heroes, none more celebrated than Sir Alan Cobham. In 1925, Cobham was preparing for his record-breaking flights, charting routes from London to far-flung parts of the empire like Cape Town. Aviation was still dangerous, expensive, and primarily a tool for military or imperial survey, but it captured the public's imagination like nothing else. People would stop what they were doing and crane their necks to watch a fragile biplane drone overhead, a symbol of daring ambition and mechanical progress, bridging the vast distances of the empire with speed. This was a physical manifestation of Britain's belief in its own ingenuity. On the ground, the train remained the undisputed monarch of mass transport. Organized into the Big Four railway companies, these steam giants moved people and freight with breathtaking efficiency. The Flying Scotsman, running non-stop from London to Edinburgh, was the epitome of speed and luxury, a symbol of industrial reliability and engineering pride. Rail travel was still the primary means of long-distance communication and commerce, efficiently connecting the disparate industrial and commercial centers of the nation. However, a serious rival was emerging from the factory floor, the motor car. Manufacturers like Morris and Austin were applying mass production techniques to bring personal transport within the reach of the growing middle class. The tiny, affordable Austin 7, often affectionately nicknamed the Baby Austin, was selling for as little as $100, finally offering the dream of personal, decentralized mobility. For a generation obsessed with escaping the lingering war trauma and the sooty constraints of the city, the car was the ultimate tool of liberation, allowing families to escape the urban grime on a Sunday drive to the coast or a quiet village. But this sudden influx of private vehicles exposed the stark primitiveness of the British road network. Roads, many of which had been paved for horse-drawn carts and coaches, were narrow, poorly surfaced, and utterly inadequate for the volume and speed of automobiles. Worse, the legal framework had not kept pace with the technology. In 1925, the law was an absolute free-for-all. There was no driving test. Anyone, regardless of skill, vision, or temperament, could buy a car and immediately take to the highway without demonstrating competence. The result was chaos. Accidents were frequent and brutal. There were few clear road signs. Traffic lights were experimental and rare, and police control was minimal. Navigating a major London intersection was a perilous, often shouting exercise in brinksmanship, combining fast metal vehicles with slow horse-drawn drays and oblivious pedestrians. The car offered unparalleled freedom, but it came at a high cost in terms of public safety. The transportation revolution of 1925 was a thrilling but anarchic moment, where the future was literally speeding down medieval lanes, demanding that the British state and its infrastructure finally catch up to the technological pace of its citizens. If the new motorcars were symbolic of physical liberation, the fashion of 1925 was the symbol of spiritual liberation. The decade was defined by a single, powerful figure, the flapper. She was the personification of the post-war rebellion, throwing off the physical and moral shackles of the Victorian and Edwardian eras with every step she took on the dance floor. The change was not subtle. It was a full-scale assault on propriety and traditional femininity, marking a decisive break from the past that was profound and permanent. The most immediate and shocking change was the hemline. For centuries, a woman's ankle was deemed suggestive. Now, skirts were daringly rising to the knee. This was more than a stylistic choice. It was practical. Short skirts were essential for the energetic movements of the Charleston and other jazz-age dances. Freed from voluminous layers of fabric, the new woman could move, work, and commute with unprecedented ease. This practical revolution was completed by the definitive abandonment of the corset, the steel and whalebone cage that had literally restricted female breathing and movement for generations. Women chose comfort, functionality, and freedom over rigid enforced shape. The shift upwards in clothing was mirrored by a drastic change in hairstyle. The long, heavy hair that symbolized female virtue was clipped into the sharp, aggressive bob or the sophisticated shingle cut. This was a statement of independence. Long hair was high maintenance and tethered a woman to the home. Short hair was modern, it was easy to manage, and it was a visual declaration that a woman's time was her own. Suddenly, you could tell the age of a woman and her political alignment simply by looking at the length of her hair. Perhaps the biggest cultural shock was the embrace of cosmetics. Before the Great War, openly wearing makeup, particularly bright lipstick and kohl eyeliner, was heavily associated with actresses and prostitutes. Respectable women used subtle tints only behind closed doors. By 1925, everything changed. Women began applying their face publicly, often using a compact mirror in the middle of a restaurant. This act, once scandalous, became normalized by mass marketing and the influence of Hollywood cinema. The brightly painted mouth became a weapon of independence, a bold visual rejection of the dowdy Victorian ideal. These changes were deeply intertwined with the political battles for suffrage. Although women over 30 had gained the right to vote in 1918, the fight for full equality, votes at 21, was still ongoing in 1925. The flapper and the new woman were not just frivolous dancers. They were the newly empowered voters and workers, challenging the notion of a predefined female role. They frequented pubs and cocktail bars previously reserved for men, and they smoked in public. Another brazen social transgression that signaled equality of vice. The cigarette holder, often long and elegant, became an accessory of power. This fusion of style and defiance created a powerful sense of modernity. It wasn't just about looking different. It was about behaving differently, making noise, and demanding to be taken seriously as an independent entity. 1925 was the midpoint of the decade when these transformations became mainstream, filtering down from the aristocratic bright young things to the working girl who saved up her wages to buy a new dress and a tube of lipstick. The era of the demure, confined female was over. The new woman was here, and she was dancing on the grave of the Victorian age, leaving behind a trail of feathers, jazz, and brightly colored lipstick. Amidst the chaos of class conflict and the hedonism of the jazz clubs, a quieter revolution was taking hold in the average British living room. The revolution of mass communication. 1925 was the year Britain truly began to listen, unified by a single technological marvel known simply as the wireless. It provided the nation with a common ear, bringing far-flung citizens into the fold of shared experience, a necessity after the divisions wrought by war and social change. This was the year the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC, solidified its unique position in the national consciousness. Although still technically a private company, the BBC operated with a profound public mission to inform, educate, and entertain the entire nation. Unlike the raucous commercial radio that dominated American airwaves, the BBC under the iron-willed Director General John Reith sought to elevate the public taste, acting as a national cultural guardian. The programs were often highbrow, classical concerts, serious lectures, and meticulously vetted news bulletins. It was an ambitious, almost utopian effort to bind a fractured society together through shared listening, promoting a sense of decency and order. The effect on the British home was immediate and transformative. Families who had previously entertained themselves with silent reading or piano playing now gathered nightly around the beautiful wooden cabinet of the radio set. The wireless became the new domestic hearth, pulling the attention of mothers, fathers, and children away from individual pursuits and uniting them in a collective experience. For the first time, news from London, music from Manchester, and a sermon from Edinburgh could be heard simultaneously in every remote village and bustling city, collapsing geographical distance and fostering a shared national identity. The radio's programming reflected the social ideals of the age. Children's Hour was an enormous hit, offering stories and lessons designed to instill moral values and a sense of shared Britishness in the post-war youth. The wireless brought live commentary of major sporting events, making national heroes out of cricketers and footballers, and it was instrumental in bringing parliamentary debates directly, albeit formally, to the electorate. However, this power was closely guarded. The BBC initially banned popular forms of music, like jazz, and dance band music during daytime hours, reflecting Reith's moralistic discomfort with the bright young things lifestyle. This censorship revealed the BBC's dual role, promoting unity while also policing culture. Yet, even as the radio achieved its mass-market dominance, an even more dramatic shift was being secretly prepared. In a small, cramped attic workshop in Soho, a Scottish inventor named John Logie Baird was obsessed with turning sound into vision. In 1925, Baird achieved a significant breakthrough. He successfully transmitted the silhouette of a talking human head using a primitive, whirling mechanical disc. This was the first true demonstration of television. His workshop was a chaotic blend of bicycle parts, sticky tape, and ingenuity, a far cry from the sleek laboratories of Marconi. For most of the public, Baird's efforts were the stuff of scientific curiosity, a fascinating yet impractical experiment, a far cry from the cozy reliability of the wireless. But his persistence, often fueled by meager funding and sheer mechanical ingenuity, laid the foundation for the medium that would eventually surpass and redefine all others. 1925 was the pivotal year when Britain discovered its common voice via the radio, even as the fragile, flickering image of the future was taking its first tentative, mechanical steps in a hidden attic. The era of information technology had officially arrived, forever changing how the British saw and heard the world, setting the stage for the global village of the future. As 1925 drew to a close and the year turned, England stood suspended in a paradoxical moment. It was a year of profound endings and equally profound beginnings. It was the last gasp of the old hierarchical world, suffocating under the weight of an unsustainable empire and a class system that was finally, fatally fracturing. The long shadow of the Great War stretched over every corner of the nation, defining its economics, its demographics, and its psychological health. We saw how the decision to return to the gold standard created an industrial pressure cooker, forcing the nation's coal miners to the brink of the largest general strike in its history. The fear of revolution was very real, even as the establishment attempted to project an image of calm superiority. The vast estates and grand hierarchies that had defined the country for centuries were melting away. unable to sustain themselves against mounting debt and the refusal of a new generation to serve in the old way. Yet, 1925 was also a year of undeniable, dazzling light. It was the moment that the modern character of Britain was forged through a defiant energy. The young rejected the mourning and hypocrisy of their elders, embracing the kinetic chaos of jazz, the liberation of the flapper, and the reckless thrill of the bright young things. The revolution in morality and freedom was expressed through short skirts, painted lips, and the confidence to take charge of one's own destiny, whether in a suburban semi-detached house or a smoky London jazz club. The technological shift was equally fundamental. The old structures were being replaced by new networks. The noise of the steam engine was beginning to share the road with the quiet efficiency of the Austin 7. The isolated voices of the nation were united by the controlled, paternal voice of the BBC Wireless, creating a new, shared cultural language. And in a forgotten Soho attic, a mechanical flicker of light, John Logie Baird's first transmission was signaling the birth of television, an invention that would soon dissolve the distance between London and the provinces entirely. England in 1925 was therefore a nation caught in the tension between its two competing selves, the proud, indebted imperial titan looking backward and the chaotic, accelerating modern state looking forward. It was a messy, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying collision between tradition and modernity. Every facet of life, from the way people dressed, to the way they traveled, to the way they found entertainment, was being reshaped by the lingering trauma of the war and the promise of mechanical speed. The world of a century ago is gone, but the reverberations of 1925 remain in the core of our culture. The questions raised by that year, the fight for economic justice, the struggle for social equality, and the tension between freedom and security, still define the national conversation today. By understanding the deep contrasts of the Imperial Twilight, we can better appreciate the enduring light of the modern British spirit it helped to create. Thank you for taking this journey through time with us to uncover the hidden history of England in 1925.